So yeah, continuing on, I've probably gone on about egalitarianism and this kind of hierarchy a lot, but it is really really important in terms of looking at these native groups and what we know about them. Um, Again, one of the other issues is we talk about is resources. Um, Usually, power and status inequality come about due to a perception of the lack of resources. Many of these groups, there was plenty of food around year round, from fish to animals to everything. Um, and we'll talk about some of their foodstuffs in a bit. Um, so again, just really kind of understand that this portion of interrelatedness between gender roles and hierarchy of status is very, very important, and it relates to really every society that we've ever seen, every culture that we've ever seen on the planet. Um, so, in terms of social organization, the subarctic peoples were broken down into nuclear and extended families. So, nuclear, very monogamous, usually just one man, one woman. However, um, polygyny did happen. Polygyny is multiple wives, um, but there was also a lot of families that had extended families, so you might have had grandparents live with you as well. Remember, the band level was very small, and then you got into regional band levels that would be bigger groups during different months of the year. Um, but yeah, uh, in terms of kinship, they were also bilateral. Remember, this means that you had cousins, aunts, and uncles on mom's side, and cousins, aunts, and uncles on dad's side as well. Um, Moedes is another name for studying kinship in anthropology. So again, this would be bilateral kinship, and which gave you more relatives and more people you could trust and go to. It also meant that you probably lived closer to all of your relatives. Um, Many tribal groups and culture groups use either patrilineal or matrilineal. Again, this is just mom's side, so you would only identify with mom's side relatives, or patrilineal, where you only identify with dad's side relatives. Now, some of us may have this where we don't really hang out with one side of the family or another due to family breakups, squabbles, whatever else. But in America, generally, we are a bilateral kinship group. Um, Another key point, I may have pointed this out as well, your book kind of goes through it, it really is going to reiterate some of these ideas, is that there was female isolation during menstruation and childbirth. When a female first started puberty, she would be isolated for amount of time, rejoin the group, and then it would start to become more of a female group thing. Females, when they live in close contact, tend to get on a similar cycle. And again, this female isolation during menstruation was one of those gender issues that we didn't really have full knowledge of when men were just going into the field and doing anthropology, or missionaries, to be honest. Anybody who contacted this group and saw that females lived in a hut or a tent or a house or a cave for a week out of the month on the edge of the village would have been a little shocked, I think, to understand how the general culture worked that way and what the women were actually doing. So again, women going into anthropology and studying these groups of people was very, very important in terms of casting a light on what was happening, right? And remember, in this time period, kids and children could join in these menstruation huts and caves, and this is really where women were passing down cultural stories, how to cook, what plants were medicine, singing, songs, music, all of those things were happening in this week-long time period where they were basically away from the men. This also gave men a male bonding time period too, as well. So interesting stuff. In our society, we have new terms that now we call man caves. There's a term for that, which is like the not stereotyping, but the guy in the garage kind of hanging out, maybe watching a football game. These are kind of holdovers from this time period, and again, human beings tended to organize themselves in this way at this level. So on a general societal, cultural level, we can look at some of these maybe reintegrations of these ideas. So kind of fascinating connections to look at. When males and females were going through puberty, they would go through a vision quest, right? And a vision quest was really almost, it's kind of, I think that we would consider it this idea of finding yourself, except in America we try to find self because we focus on the individual. In these groups, it was more about finding place, and it was more about finding place in the universe, in nature, and then your connection to the group. And basically, what is your place going to be as an adult in this group? So after this vision quest that you may have help with by spirit animals or animism, some kind of spiritual helper. These kinds of things help individuals, but they would usually go out on their own, fasting or eating certain foods, or even some groups would have probably hallucinogenics or something else along with this vision quest. And then after you finish that, you were seen as a rightful member of society that would have a vote on things and would be considered an adult. Remember, this is also a vision quest would be considered a rite of passage. And in America, again, our rites of passage are murky, right? We don't have a clearly delineated rite of passage. And in these groups, they did. When you go in to this vision quest, a child, you come out the vision quest as an adult, and society sees you as that. We don't necessarily have that. When I do these kind of studies with my cultural anthropology classes, everybody gives me a different definition from turning 18 to be able to vote, but then you're still living with your parents, or they're still paying for college. Then some people say, well, college is a rite of passage, but not everybody does that. Not everybody even gets their driver's license at 16. So we don't actually have this, and there's been a decent amount of research. However, one of my focuses is definitely the lack of rite of passage in America as being an interesting cultural process where even people my age are being called kids, right? I still get called kid by a fair amount of adults, even though I'm close to 39 years old. So again, and some of you guys may have experienced this with the older generation too. It's in a way, it is a hierarchy, a status hierarchy, to not be able to recognize people as adults in society. So this vision quest definitely acted as a rite of passage. Again, like I talked about, these groups were monogamous. Polygyny was fairly common, but divorce was simple. If you just moved out of your hut with your husband, or from your husband or your wife, that basically meant that you were divorced. There was no formal ceremony like we had to go through. It was not a cultural taboo. Ultimately, if you weren't getting along, they didn't want to force you to stay in that relationship. Adultery was taboo and punished in this group. If women, your book points out, if women, again, we have some male centric concepts here. If women were found to have committed adultery, sometimes they would cut their noses off. I would want to, really, I want a time machine to go back to see if this was happening, 5,000 years ago. Or was this an inputted idea to somehow some Christianity, religious maybe integration into their culture group? And again, hard to tell when we had 400 years of contact without anthropologists actually doing kind of natural cultural studies before diffusion. However, I'm not, we had clearly defined gender roles in this society. So if I'm just looking at that from what we know, adultery may have been part of this taboo with these groups. And again, different from the Arctic people who had wife sharing ceremonies, right? So this would have been kind of a more standardized gender role idea here. Death was viewed as a loss of power, and when I talk about the religion or cosmology, the subarctic people had this version of power, which is fascinating. But the idea that we all have power, all living beings, and even rock formations to a certain degree have power, and it comes from the universe, and it is our loss of power, or that power going out, is one of the reasons why we die. Euthanasia was common as well. Again, like the Arctic people, if you were older, you may ask for basically assisted suicide, or you may go kind of take your own life in terms of wandering off in the wilderness and not eating anymore. Um, so also not necessarily a death taboo in that way. Music, dancing, and storytelling were a big part of their lives. Remember, in the summer, people did a lot of hunting, gathering. In the winter, it was very cold, so you wouldn't go outside and do a lot. So you had to entertain yourselves on a daily basis inside kind of one of these more formal structures, and we'll talk about that when we get into their housing a bit more. And you had to entertain yourself, and they did this through music, dancing, and storytelling. Economics. So in terms of what they ate, caribou, very, very common in this area as well. And again, they migrated based on the seasons. Moose and deer. Fish were very, very important part of their diet as well. And again, all of these meats would have been smoked. So during the summer, they probably killed more meat than they actually needed for the time. But they would have smoked the meat to last them during the winter months. Dog was the only domesticated animal, or only domesticated really product. Very, very important to their cosmology. Please make sure that you read about the dog in the Cree cosmology section. The dog is very, very important to them. And again, remember, in terms of dog domestication, we keep backing that data. I've heard as far back as 40 to 20,000 years ago, we domesticated the dog. And remember, nothing else gets domesticated for another 10,000 years after that. In terms of like 12,000 years ago was kind of the time period that they put on goats and sheep being domesticated. What's fascinating is that your author points out that the births happened in the winter months, and this is exactly 9 months after basically caribou season. So after they were able to eat a lot and put on some fat, women were able to get pregnant. Now, one of the things here is that hunter-gatherer groups, again, had low birth rates. And what I mean by that is it was just part of their life to not have as many kids. The average kid for hunter-gatherer groups was 2 to 3. Okay, and two reasons for that was hunter-gathering was very strenuous on the body, which meant that you were in shape, which meant women had low fat contents and weren't able to build a lot of fat because they were moving around a lot. This lowers progesterone levels along with long nursing seasons. So a lot of times women would nurse for 2 to 3 years, and this would also drop progesterone levels. But this would correlate to these groups basically gorging themselves on caribou meat and fat during the summer or during that kind of season, right? We're talking more late winter, early spring, if we're looking at winter kind of births. So women were able to put fat on during this time period and probably relied more on that than the gathering, right, portion where you're basically working your calories to a kind of a lower fasting rate almost. They were able to put fat on, then ultimately get pregnant. So they all kind of had babies at the same time, which would correlate to this hunter-gatherer group. I talked about the meat being smoked, which is an important piece. Pemmican was their version of trail mix, which would have been berries, fat, and dried meat or smoked meat, basically compacted into kind of we would call them power bars or protein bars today, energy bars. These are what they would make. And winter you would use these as a full-blown source of energy and actually probably really, really nutritious, right, in terms of the human body and what it can handle. We're talking about a lower carb, definitely no complex carbs. We throw all kinds of stuff into our trail mix, but they had basically fat and protein, probably a lean protein, smoked meat, and then you had berries. You're getting your antioxidants and your proteins and your fats. And to a certain level, you're getting enough carbs to feed that sugar part of the body that is required. They did do fishing under the ice, so they would cut holes. They would look for fish. Birch sap was used as candy, so you could just scrape off a piece of birch sap and eat it like candy. And then spruce sap was used as chewing gum.